Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pitts, Ukraine War Frontline update for the 17th of May 2024. If you don't know what the lines on my map mean, please pause the video and check out the screen. We're going to go to the northern area, Kharkiv Oblast, where the Russians are still continuing attacking and having some success, although it definitely seems to have slowed down. There is a really interesting article in the Washington Post talking about how they managed to succeed in very quickly, the Russians, before them being slowed down. And there was one thing that really shouted out to me in this article. So, second Russian invasion of Kharkiv caught Ukraine unprepared, in the Washington Post. Ukraine's 125th Territorial Defense Brigade, stretched thin along a roughly 27-mile stretch of Kharkiv's border with Russia, used reconnaissance drones to monitor daily how Moscow was steadily building up forces for a possible attack. But the morning it happened, May the 10th, the brigade lost all of its video feeds due to Russian electronic jamming. Its Starlink devices, satellite internet the Ukrainian military relies on for basic communication, failed. The first time it was knocked out completely for them since Russia's invasion in February 2022. Quote, "We were left at a certain point completely blind," said a drone commander in the brigade. The Post agreed to identify him by his call sign Artist, in keeping with Ukrainian military protocol. Quote, "This was the biggest problem. We didn't see how they were moving. We only worked through radio or through phones where they still worked." Artist, a 53-year-old sergeant, said. The drone feeds, he said, simply disappeared. And then within days, the Russians had captured for the second time some 50 square miles. So this is pretty significant. The Russians are able to jam Starlink. That's the first I've heard of it. The power of Starlink being that it has enabled communication fairly successfully without being jammed. I could be wrong there. But if the Russians were able to basically stop their drones from being able to be operated, then that completely, or it goes a large way to explaining why the Russians were able to have such success on the first day, because the Ukrainians would have been operating blind. Like, without those drones being able to be used, without typical communication systems operating, having to go through old school radios and phones, you can imagine that the Russians were able to take a great advantage of that opportunistically. So I think that is a really significant component of why the Russians would have been able to succeed as much as they initially did. And then obviously there are some things that have been done since then to ameliorate the situation for the Ukrainians, I would imagine, so that they have been able to much more successfully slow the Russians down. We can see in this, there are two salients here that are not yet connected. Indeed, there seems to be a counterattack in the middle there by the Ukrainians around Storitsia. I think that's what it's called. Storitsia. And the Russians have been pushed back in Zeleny area as well. So in that more central area, the Russians have been hemmed back, but actually to the east of the eastern salient here by Vovchansk, the Russians have had some success kind of laterally moving along the border. A little bit of success along this water feature, and Andrew Perpetua agreeing that the salient, that long salient that the Russians had taken yesterday, according to Surrey maps, Andrew Perpetua somewhat agrees with that, although there's a little bit more of a charitable interpretation of the grey zone by Surrey maps going towards the east there. So that's what's happening broadly on the map. There's evidence that the Russian soldiers are posed in front of Vovchansk's Stela. Now, that's going to be I presume, a big rock saying, "Welcome to Vovchansk" or something. I don't know whether that's the northerly one or the southerly one, so it's going to make quite a bit of difference, and I assume that's in the north, and that's not really going to tell you much if that is the case. That's likely up here. But anyway, I don't particularly know. So we then come on to Surat Maps' description of what has happened, although this won't include today's activity. So this will be the summary of yesterday's activity. So in the Kharkiv axis, the Russian armies continue advancing on the northern datches of Lipsy. So that's around here. So Lipsy is this, we're going to be talking about this settlement there. I'm pretty sure. We've got Lukyantsy there. And, it could be this one just beneath Lyobake. which is that small village. I'm sure Lipsy. Oh, there it is. There's Lipsy. So it could be that Lipsy goes all the way up there. I'm not sure. It seems to be quite a large settlement, but it does go on to these other names. So some kind of conurbation. But this could be where they're talking about moving towards actually. No, it could be there along the river. Into Lipsy. So anyway, Syriac Maps then continues, made significant advances from Lukyantsy, so that's more around here, along the Lipets River and Pilna Lipsy Road, reaching the outskirts of the latter locality. From Chuhuv axis, most of the town of Vovchansk above the Vovcha River has been taken by Russian troops, 20 to 25% of the entire town. Only the area where the police station, high school number 2 and industrial plant Volchansky Aggregati Zavod are located remains under Ukrainian control. On the other hand, clashes between Russian and Ukrainian forces continue at Staritsia. So that is going to be concerning the activity in Vovchansk. So I don't know if this is because that's a very large amount of land taken. I think that's maybe a combination of yesterday's mapping and today's, quite possibly. So anyway, the Russians have taken all of this kind of areas according to Syriac Maps. Andrew Perpetua Deep State Map, not so convinced, although there is a little bit of agreement with that, as mentioned. That's salient. Then we've got this potentially a pushback there in Staritsia, where the Russians have seen the Ukrainians counterattacked. I think that's more probable than just a rejigging of the lines, but either case with Syriac Maps, you never quite know. And then again, I think there's a combination of maps going on here because we have this area that I think was from yesterday, and a little bit there looks like today's move. But nonetheless, some small gains in Vovchansk, which I think says quite a bit that the most recent mapping update is only very minimal in the town. It shows that the Russians are going to be struggling a lot more, but they are pushing to the east over along the border there. So that's the situation on the map. We'll go to the Institute for the Study of War, American military think tank, that says the limited combat power that Russian forces have so far committed to offensive operations in northern Kharkiv Oblast may already be degraded. This is interesting because, they supposedly got 50,000 troops, but I don't think they're using all 50,000. They're possibly waiting to do something in Sumy as well. So they're not committing all of their troops that they've amassed along these 3 oblasts. Supposed to be 50,000 along these 3 oblasts, possibly 30,000 being used here, but who quite knows? Sumy is boiling up for an attack possibly anytime soon. But here the ISW is saying that the forces are actually somewhat degraded, may already be degraded. Ukrainian military observer Moshevets stated yesterday that elements of the 18th Motorized Rifle Division and 7th Motorized Rifle Regiment have suffered heavy losses attacking along the Hlyobake-Lukyantsy front, and that the recent tempo of Russian offensive operations in the area has significantly decreased. So that's in this particular area that the Russians may have suffered some significant casualties. As the ISW continues, missing out some of the technical stuff about who's fighting where, Mashevets noted that the other Russian force groupings do not have scare quotes free combat-ready forces and assets at the regiment brigade level to transfer to the northern grouping of forces that would help sustain and intensify offensive operations along the border. A Ukrainian battalion commander in the Kharkiv direction stated on May the 16th that the Chechen Akhmat forces are also operating in the area. We knew that before we knew they'd been positioned up there. Although these are likely limited elements that transferred to Belgorod for border security purposes in summer 2023, Russian forces appear to have launched their offensive operation in northern Kharkiv before they had completed bringing the northern group of forces up to its reported planned end strength and may lack sufficient combat-ready forces to achieve their operational objectives in Kharkiv Oblast. This is not good news for the Russians here, as according to the DSW, of course, pinch of salt and all that. But they appear to have taken some heavy losses. They appear to be suboptimal strength anyway. And of course, they're not going to be the crack troops, because there are no crack troops left in this war for the Russians and somewhat for the Ukrainians that aren't already completely are being used elsewhere. So the 44th Naval Infantry Brigade and the 155th, they've been reconstituted so many times that the 44th was 9 times have been reconstituted. So it's been force diluted over time. They just don't have crack troops. So therefore, they are going to be bringing, if they are new troops, there will be fresh troops that are poorly trained or not trained for a huge amount of time and may not have the requisite equipment that they would like, certainly if you compare them to an attacking force at the beginning of the war. So the Ukrainians will be degrading an already suboptimal force, and possibly they have lost quite a few elements already, and there aren't the free elements to throw into helping the Russian attack in this particular sector. That's obviously a very positive outlook for the Ukrainians there. So it's not to say that that's definitely what's going on, but it could be that the Russians may struggle here. And then you're wondering, well, if you are going to attack in Sumy, do you have the forces that you're using here to attack up there? Will it be an even smaller contingent? And how will they fare there? Because I'm pretty sure the Ukrainians will be thinking, right, the mistakes we made down here, let's make sure we don't make them if the Russians attack in Sumy. Otherwise heads will roll, right? So you can imagine that this is going to be the best that Russia is going to be able to achieve. Like, this is going to be their most, I think, profitable front, and I don't think it's been like massively successful. I think it was initially, oh my goodness, and where the defenses and not enough mines, but actually they haven't, as far as I'm aware, they have not crossed any Ukrainian major defenses. So the first line of defense has not fallen, and let me know what you think, whether you're as positive as I'm not like super positive that the Ukrainians will be losing troops and equipment there. They have lost quite a lot of equipment, the Ukrainians, over the last week, much more than they usually would. So I imagine that in defending here, they're defending with quite a lot of mechanized equipment, including artillery, that the Russians are doing a fairly good job of attriting. We've seen a lot of Lancet successes, and I think that is coming from this area. We've seen Bogdanas, a whole bunch of Bogdanas that have been destroyed or damaged, and other artillery. So the Ukrainians are doing, the Russians are doing a fairly good job of attriting Ukrainian mechanized equipment here, but at the same time the Russians will be taking some fairly significant losses too. Now, no changes to the northeastern axis at all from Kupiansk to Svatova to Kreminna. There's been quite a bit of activity up around Berestova, near Svatova here, as we saw yesterday and the day before, to Baivka up there, but nothing reported today. There's a little bit of change here in Bilohorivka, which I say a little bit, that's really significant for this area, that amount of ground taken. Surat Mats has claimed this before in this area and still has that under Russian control, even though there were Ukrainians seen in the trenches here like long after that attack took place and had been lost. And so it's arguably, I think it's much more likely that Andrew Perpetua's lines and indeed Deep State's lines are correct here. Deep State, although they're pro-Ukrainian, they are sometimes fairly much in alignment with Surat Maps. So it's interesting, to see that. But anyway, Surat Maps' claims for this area, and this is difficult topography for the Russians to negotiate. You've got high ground just to the west here, which is going to have a lot of influence over what happens around here. Now, they could have got to the edge of their higher ground to the west before it goes into this valley, but I don't know. I'm always a little bit dubious of large Surat Maps increases of Russian control in places that are fairly established already. So we shall see. Maybe that has happened, or maybe it's just an attack that could have been repelled and the Russians then retreat, but Surat Maps keeps those red lines in place. We shall see. But they might well have made some gains there. Then we come to Chasiv Yar, where there's Interestingly, no real change in the Chasiv Yar area. It's actually around Klishchivka where Andriy Perpetua has some gains for the Russians, just pushing south of the railway line as it doglegs around Klishchivka there. That would be fairly significant. I don't know whether that has happened over the last 24 hours, though, because it looks like that's in alignment with what Surat Maps has already had for quite a long time. So it's possible that there's just some, I don't know, evidence of shelling that's taken place there of Russians from the Ukrainians, and that shows that the Russians controlled that area rather than an attack in the last 24 hours. So anyway, that change has taken place, but nothing around Chasiv Yar. Interesting that Euromaidan Press here reports that soldiers of the 10th Brigade in Chasiv Yar basements preparing to storm Russian positions in Kromova on the 11th of May. So that's going back almost a week, but there's some interesting, some very arresting photography here of these troops. They restock on ammo, discuss assaults, contact loved ones, and rest before the offensive. Today, Ukrainian forces maintain ground as Russian troops relentlessly attack. I think this is quite revealing because it talks about the Ukrainians themselves going out on an assault. So they are doing an active defence there. They aren't just necessarily sitting back and soaking up the pressure, although it is relentless, as mentioned there. But we have seen the Ukrainians push back a little to the south of Ivanivska, so it is fairly dynamic around there, although Russians are obviously continually pressurising. But what is fascinating is this is supposedly the most important, the biggest vector of the Russians' attack across the whole front line. Like Chasiv Yar is supposed to be like the one they most want because it's the key to Konstantinivka, Druzhkivka, Kramatorsk, Sloviansk, and thus Seversk as well. You know, all of these are connected, and they've got to take Chasiv Yar. And if in the middle of the Russians, supposedly this is like the Russian offensive, they've committed all those troops to Kharkiv, that's now grinding down a little bit, but we'll see how that develops. And there's been very little change in Chasiv Yar, considering this is supposed to be the big one. I don't know what that says about the whole Russian offensive. And again, I don't want to be too positive for Ukraine here, but that I would be worried if I was the Russians and this was a state of affairs there particularly. And then when we come down to Avdiivka, past the northern area, we come to Pervomaisky, where or actually Netalove now, really. Pervomaisky is been and gone. The Russians are pushing, according to Surat Maps, further along the course of the river here, and the road, the E50 road, from Pervomaisky through to Karlivka, and that's Surat Maps making those claims there. As discussed here by them, Russian army took control over most of the locality of Netalove. Combing operations are taking place in the houses located on the western edge. So that's happening, and no other move there, which I think, again, when the Russians were having all of this success around Ocheretny and along the Derna River, that they are not having continued success. Yes, they need to take breathers. You can't always keep the momentum going, but that the momentum doesn't seem as great as it was a couple of weeks back shows that the Ukrainians have stabilized, I think, this front a little bit. And again, it makes you wonder how much the Russians have left in the tank. What is their strength in depth? Like, how are the reserves looking? That's not to say it's all over for the Russians and well done, Ukraine, you've won the war. Not at all. But what this should, I think, lead the Russians to expedite is a mobilization. Like, what this tells me at the moment is that even with sort of supposedly 50,000 troops or 30,000 troops to access in 30 to 50,000 around this area, they are struggling elsewhere. The southern front line is looking fairly static. Dnipro River, they still can't dislodge those Ukrainians in Krinky. The northeastern axis is really stable, like comparatively speaking. The Russians will need to mobilize. Surely there's got to be a national mobilization if the Russians want to get as much as they can at. If they want to take the Donbass, which is like your bare minimum, and they're not going to use those troops to do that, they've used the 50,000 up north, then they need to nationally mobilise. So expect that to happen soon, possibly with the new guy in charge of the MOD and coming back from China with promises of new kit from China. Maybe you could see an announcement of mobilisation, one that we expected after the March the 17th presidential elections, and of course that hasn't happened so far. Anyway, going further to the south here, we have the Russians making some fairly significant gains according to Surat maps around Herivka. During the last 5 days, the Russians took control over most of the locality of Herivka in the south and the southeastern plantations. The Ukrainian army is still present in the houses at the end of Centralna and Kirova streets in the south, and at the western end of Peschana Street in the north. So, according to Surat maps, still some presence of the Ukrainians around the extremities of Herivka. So you see Centralna Street there, and I presume that street to the north. So that is around the area to the west of Mariinka, but no agreement for the other mappers there, so that's worth noting. No changes to the southern front line, as according to any of the mappers, and no change to Krynki either. And it's just really interesting when you go to the Institute for the Study of War and you look through all of these paragraphs. I mean, some of them just have very little going on. So north of Bakhmut, virtually nothing. And then this is Chasiv Yar and Bakhmut. There's just a really small amount of text there, and no confirmed changes, I think speaks volumes itself. So really nothing much to report elsewhere. So am I being too optimistic? I don't know. I mean, the Ukrainians are in trouble, but they are getting more troops on the way. You know, mobilization is due to take place. They're talking about maybe getting, I was reading 20,000 from the prison through, mobilizing people, convicts and whatnot, and that will make a big difference. And of course, you've got to train them, and that takes time. But the Zelensky saying, well, they've got no shortage of artillery ammo at the moment, etc., etc. So I don't know. Let me know what you think, guys. Anyway, thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share. Take care, and speak to you soon.